Welcome back, and we're going to talk about section 12.2 in this segment, so you'll follow along with me on your note packet. So 12.2, we're going to talk about some of the types of displays of data in statistics. So in 12.2, we're talking about frequency distribution and some of the statistical graphs. So reading along with me, it says it's not uncommon for a statistician and others to have to analyze thousands of pieces of data. Every single response to something would be considered a piece of data. When the amount of data is large, it is helpful to construct a frequency distribution to help you organize it into categories. So that's the first thing we're going to do here is we've got, in example 1, we did a survey of 64 families. So say they just reached out to 64 families with maybe one of those random or systematic type of surveys that we talked about in the last segment. So here's what they found. They talked to 64 families, remember. So I think I've got this all on the board here. I hope you can see all that. So we've got these 64 families represented, and they've been rearranged at least so that they're in an ordering, so that'll help us. So 64 families, and they said, how many children do you have in your family? So this family said none, so on 1, 2 children in these families. That seemed pretty common, right? And then these people said they had 3 children, some had 4 children, 5 children, 6, 7, 8, and then one family had 9 children. So those were the responses. So at least now they're in order. Imagine if they were just randomly, arranged. At least we've ordered them for you to kind of help with that. But a frequency distribution will help even further. It will say, okay, so let's count this up. How many people said the number of children, let's say number of children, here. And we look at our responses and we're like, oh, what have we got here? Some said there were 0, some had 1, 2. There were responses for all of these, so I'm going to write all that down. And then I'm going to count up how many people said what. So how many people said they did not have children? So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So out from 0, then the frequency, we'll call that the frequency, how often that occurred. So the frequency for that response was 8. Then we keep going through that. How many people said they had 1 child? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 said that, so on and so forth. So I've got your numbers here for you on your notes. So let me go ahead and write that down. 1, 2, 1. Okay. Then I have some questions for you. So if you want to pause, answer these questions. Feel free to always do that. I want to keep rolling though. So this helps us read the data more easily, but then we need to be able to interpret the data and understand what this represents in comparison. So there should be a good title, helps you see that. All right, then we say, I can quickly see there are 11 families that have 3 children. So there's 11 families that have 3. Yes, 11's on there twice, isn't it? So 11 times they said they had 3 children. I can also see that having 2 children seems to be the most common response. We're going to call that the mode response. So my question for you is, how many families stated they have 2 children? So 2 children, that was the number 18. Number 18 should be in that blank. 18 people said they had 2 children. You can also verify it by counting here. You should have 18 twos. How many families, or the frequency, that had 9 children? How many times did someone say they have 9 children? Just once. You can see it up here, but you can also see it's the same thing listed on our frequency distribution, just helping us with the counting. All right, so that's that page. Next page, we have another example. It says sometimes the data is grouped even more. For example, instead of listing each one of these, 0 through 9, which I think helps me kind of see it, and it was reasonable for this. It just depends on the problem, what's reasonable. But we could have grouped it if there would have been 10, 11, 12. If there would have been a lot more numbers, and in some types of data there would be. This is probably reasonable here though. But say there would have been more. Then you could group it and say, how many said 0 to 2? So you could group the data and say 0 to 2 in that response. You're not going to get as much detailed information, though, note that, but still it might be necessary depending on the question. So if we said how many said they had 0 to 2, that's most of our data. The 8, 11, and 18 would add all that together, and that would have been 37. But if we do choose to group data, there's rules for that. You know, we always got a rule in math for everything, right? There's rules for that. So if we do choose to go 0 to 2, then the next group needs to be consistent and start at the next number 3 and have the same amount of data in it or the same class width. So it would be 3 to 5. Then they have to keep being consistent. We call that the width. So if we go 0 to 2, and that would be 0, 1, and 2, those three types of scenarios. How many children do you have? 0, 1, or 2. We would call that the class width. The class width in this case, if we did 0 to 2, we would call that class width of 3, between 0 and 2. So you got to kind of watch out for this one because it looks like you'd say there's just 2 numbers there, but you got to count the 0 response, the 1 response, and the 2 response. So there's actually 3 types of things, pieces of data in their responses. So you got to be responsible to know that width would be actually 3. So when we do the next category, we'll start at the next number 3. We can't have any overlap in this, so we start at 3, and it needs to have the same amount of responses in it, 3, 4, 5. So the next number would be 5. So between 3 and 5, we would group those, so the same amount of groupings, and then see we'd need to group that, and then we'd need to group 3 responses there. So between 3 and 5, we'd count up 11, 6, and 4, which would be 21, and so on. So we could group the data. That is sometimes more reasonable. All right, so here are your rules. If you're going to group your data, number 1, they must have that same width. Number 2, they can't overlap. Only one piece of data belongs in one category. You can't have any overlapping there. Which I think you just know that. If you did 0 to 2, you'd know you'd want to start at the next number, 3. You wouldn't put 2 here as well. You'd go to the next number up. No overlapping. And 3, each piece of data should belong to only one class. All right, some other terms to be familiar with. The word modal class. Mode, as we learned in the last segment, mode means occurs the most frequently. So the mode is the most common response. So occurs the most frequently. So in our example, 2 children was the mode answer. The modal class would be 2 there, right? So again, mode means occurs the most or the most common response. So our modal class was the second class. Okay, and then we could say the midpoint of a class, which is also called the class mark. The class mark is in the middle of that particular class. So the class mark, in here there weren't groups. So say we had a grouping of 0 to 2. If we grouped it from 0 to 2, the mark would be in the middle, which would be the number 1. You would add the two extremes and divide by 2, and that'd be the number in the middle of that. So the class mark or the midpoint. The upper limits would be the upper side of this in the groupings, and then the lower limits down the left-hand side. All right, now we're going to do an example with teacher salaries, an example with a bunch of data about teacher salaries. Let's see if I can get that written on here without driving you crazy here. Probably be best if you were looking at that in your on your notes there, though. So we've got $21,001, $21,400, $21,500, and so on and so on and so on. So there are, how many of those did I say I did? I don't know if I listed out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times 3, 27. Maybe I did say that. We've got 27 teacher salaries. That would be the total amount of data we have. And we're going to chunk that up into classes. So I made the first class start with $21,001. And then at a high range, I went to 24,000. Now that will be set in your homework problem. They'll probably tell you, make the first class this. You know, if you were just designing your own, you could do anything you want here. So there's no rule for that, like how big you make your classes. Just once you decide, you know, you be consistent. So in your real homework, though, they'll probably just say, here, start with this one. This is going to be our rule, and then you fill in what the next one would be. So if we did $21,001, the lowest one here, and grouped it up to 24,000, then the next category would need to start at $24,001, and then go up to the same amount, the same width there, and you can figure that out to see how many numbers are between here and here, make it exactly the same here. And then it'll be $27,001 and $30,000 and so on. So you get your data grouped consistently with the same width, nothing overlapping, every piece of data belonging to exactly one category. And it's kind of easier once you get your first class going, figure out what this is and start the next number. Then you can kind of see there was 3,000 between here and here, these lower class limits. So there needs to be 3,000 between this, so 24,000 plus 3,000, 27 plus 3,000 plus 3,000. So you kind of go by that as well. All right, then 39,001. That makes $42,001 to $45,000. All right, and that covered all my categories, I think, there. All right, then I have some questions for you about that on the next page. All right, so looking at the next page, figure out what the class width is. So you need to subtract and figure out the width from here to here. Remember, you always have to add 1 if you subtract this minus this. Remember in our easier example, if you did 0 to 2, it looks like the width is 2, but actually it's the number 0, the number 1, the number 2. The width was 3. And then if you go to the next class, we said 3 to 5. So probably, to me, the easier way to figure out the width is how far is it from these two numbers. It's easier for me to see, actually. So the width from 2 to 5, there's 3 between that. And also you can figure it out here from 0 to 3. The width is 3. And then the next one is 6 to 9, and so on. So it's easier, I think, to kind of figure out from here to here, because if you do just 2 minus 0, you'll get 2. You've got to add 1 more to it because you haven't counted your starting point in that way. So there's a couple of ways to figure width, but my recommendation is if you've got the numbers down the right-hand side or the left-hand side, kind of subtract right there. Between 5 and 2, the difference is 3. I would call that the class width, and you can see it pretty easily on all these. When you do 27,000 minus 24,000, which you could do it here too, it's the same, but you got that 001. 27,000 minus 24,000 is a difference of 3,000 each time. So our class width, we'd say, is 3,000. The next question says, what is the lower class limit of class number 3? So we count 1, 2, 3. This would be our third class. And the lower limit, your answer there should be 27,001 for that answer. Question number 3, what's the class midpoint of number 4? So 1, 2, 3, 4, the fourth class. The midpoint, you would find the middle of that. So you need to add these two numbers together and half it to find the middle of that. So do that calculation. I have this is question number, what am I on? Number 3. Question number 3, I get 31,500.5 for that answer. Question number 4, what's the modal class? Remember, mode means occurs the most frequently. So, I haven't written that down yet. You kind of have to look back over, and what is that? Have I answered that yet? I don't think we've calculated. I didn't write it here on the board. It's on your note packet. But I do have the frequencies listed, and you had to go through that whole list of teacher salaries, and it looked like the most common from 24,001 to 27,000, I don't know what year data or if this is even real-time data, so don't, judge it too harshly. But in this particular study, between those two numbers, there was 9 responses, 9 times for the frequency of how many times they said that was the salary range. Okay, so that would be your modal class. I'd say number 2 there. Number 5, if there were to be an additional class number 8, how would you write that? So that's important. But if we stopped at 45,001, the next one would start at 001, and then I would go up 3,000, on each side, so it'd be 48,000. So your answer there is 45,001 to 48,000. And then lastly, we're going to construct a histogram to display this data. I'm going to come back to you on the next video and show how we could display this.